So my name is Eric, PSPA and CVSP. I actually was part of the development team that put together the new CVSP 203. This is not 203, this is 204, right? Okay, I had nothing to do with that, so don't blame me. That being said, we're doing Marx here. This used to be part of 203, it's now part of 204. I guess it makes sense in both places. If there's a term or a concept that I use during the lecture that messes you up, that you don't understand, you can put your hand up and I'll try to put the brakes on and explain that to you. If I'm not making sense to you, feel free to put up your hand. You can shout or just put up your hand, I'll try to stop. But this is a pretty intense talk, but it's all weird and it's kind of digested for you, so just follow along here. So Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. In this talk on Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, I will focus on the first two sections and 2/3 of the text, which develop the core of their project. The last two portions of the text that I won't discuss here are largely assessments of different political movements, ideologies, and thinkers of their day. Before I begin, it is important to understand that only one of at least two forms of Marxian thought is on display in the Communist Manifesto. There's really two Marxes. The Marx of historical materialism, in this case. The other, the Marxian economist, Marx the political economist, would only truly emerge later on with the work of Das Kapital of the 1850s. Marx's voluminous, 3-volume, massive encyclopedia of modern capitalism. I don't recommend, if you're interested in Marx, starting there because it will make your brain hurt. I refer to it as Marxian, the Communist Manifesto, because Marx was, by most accounts, the author and main force behind its creation. In 1847, Marx and Engels were appointed by the Communist League. There's a good movie called The Young Marx. It actually shows this process. Were appointed by the Communist League to draw up a singular statement that would lay out the goals of communism. Too long had their enemies in Europe denounced communism with lies, and the time had come to set the record straight on its real intentions for Europe and the world. By the manifesto's publication in 1848, revolutions had broken out all over Europe. Some of these carried on for prolonged periods, and others would break out later during the 1870s. A grain crisis, a lack of food, drove food prices up and led to an industrial downturn that saw many laborers lose their jobs and wages dropping throughout Europe. So there was a massive economic crisis. Well, the demands of the dissenters, those who dissented, were largely liberal. What we understand today is liberal. More freedom, less government intervention. Radical thinkers and activists from across the spectrum, the ideological spectrum, the political spectrum, mobilized to bring about political change. The Communist Manifesto's first section, let me just check on something. Okay, got that. Its first section on the relation of the bourgeois and the proletariat. What is the bourgeois and the proletariat? Anybody? Who are the bourgeois? Mostly you guys are the bourgeois. But what is it to be a bourgeois? A non-laborer. High class. Socioeconomic class. What do the bourgeois have that the proletariat don't? Money and power. Possession of lands, perhaps it sounds feudal a little bit, but it has more to do with possession of capital, right? And capital is productive capacity, the material infrastructure productive capacity in the proletariat. That's really mostly not you guys. Who are they? The working guys and gals. The only thing they own is their own labor and their bodies, right? So, okay. So he starts out by informing us that communism had become a term of insult and rejection of all progressive movements in Europe. Anywhere that anybody started out trying to get rid of the kings and the queens and the nobility, the lords and the dukes, right? The argument was they were communists. It was a dirty finger pointed at anybody who resisted or sought to overturn the existing order against the status quo. Whoever opposed the old orders in Europe, whoever opposed the power of traditional authority, was demonized by the establishment as a communist. Sounds like, modern United States actually as well. The ghost of change that communism seemed to bring to life haunted the status quo. Behind the liberal movements that called for rights and freedom, Marx foresaw a call to major social transformation, radical social transformation. Right? Liberalism was itself out of date for Marx by virtue of the contradictions of its political promise, right? Freedom and rights, and the reality of its economic marriage to capitalism, which really was regressive, did not permit or provide for rights of freedom. Freedom could not be realized. Freedom could not be realized by the individual alone, where the capitalist harmony of economics and politics structures all society in reflection of class power. Right? Alienation, the divorce of life from meaningful creative activity in society, and not freedom, is the real condition of class society under the conditions of capitalism. Right? The theoretical freedom of liberalism had to be overturned to realize concrete freedom through communism. The first pillar of Marxism, its first principle, explored in the Communist Manifesto, is the articulation of what Marx and Engels called historical materialism. Right? The way a society produces and distributes wealth is the foundation of all other social and political developments. Right? Base and superstructure. Right? In Marxian terms, the social and political superstructure, the top stuff, culture, politics, Facebook, movies, art, are all ultimately, our social relationships are all ultimately a reflection of the economic reality underground, the unconscious, the social unconscious, that really, upon which everything else is formed. Right? Society and culture are a bubble blown by a more fundamental base, and that is political economy, and in our situation, in Marx's situation, that is capitalism. Here the bourgeois does not dominate only because of its ownership of factories, capital, but by its dominance over cultural and social life as well, the superstructure. The bourgeoisie translates its economic power into political power, allowing it to advance its agenda within society in terms of culture, education, art, and law, you name it, influencing all realms of personal experience. In fact, the individual psychology, the psychology of the individual from Marx itself is an expression of the fundamental fact of our economic mode of production. The way we produce, the way we distribute, ultimately leads to everything, including you. The way we think about the world. The materialist analysis of history teaches that the truth of history, as we have known it up until the present time, is the truth of class conflict. This is the ultimate truth, the ultimate foundation of the way reality, social reality, and history is formed. Inequality and class domination, elevated to social normality, is the fundamental truth of all society up until the present. If you want to understand a period in time, you have to look at it in terms of class conflict. Right? With all the tension in Lebanon today, we can see that class conflict is again, right, raising its head as there is greater divide and inequality in this society, and Lebanon is not alone in that. Whether in time of peace or war, civil rest or unrest, the truth behind social order and disorder is none other than that of class relations and production, the base. All suggestions to the contrary are part and parcel of an attempt to hide, to conceal the real workings of power. Political ideology is logic and argument which justifies and conceals and normalizes class divisions and class inequality. For Marx and Engels, this logic had to be seen for what it was, a making permanent of the privilege of one class and the subordination and exploitation, in this case of the proletariat. Class membership, more than anything else, represents the organizing principle of life. You are who your class is. You are what your class membership makes you. One might say that the real force holding a state and society together is class for Marx and Engels. But it's not a beautiful thing. It's not about high class versus low class. Class is an evil for Marx and Engels. There is no high class. There's only the powerful class, the haves and the have-nots. Unlike past eras, which maintained great differences in class and station, the modern world represents a simplification for Marx and Engels. There are only really two players on the battlefield, and that is the capitalist class and the bourgeoisie. Right? The worker and the owner of the mode of production. The latter represents the group that owns the meat of production, the capitalists, the factories, and capital needed to sustain and feed the productive machine and labor necessary to it. The proletariat, on the other hand, owns nothing but its own labor and is forced to sell itself to the capitalist to survive. Right? It is this symmetry that for Marx maps out the challenge of the present-day class struggle, and that for him would be true today, and for Marxists today, that remains true. For many analysts who continue to be influenced by Marx and Engels, the challenge has not changed. Now we move on to feudalism. With the emergence of civil society and the rights-holding citizens in the Middle Ages, Marx and Engels tell us that the capitalist class had emerged from the feudal classes of the Middle Ages. With the opening up of America and the colonial world, this class transformed. The bourgeoisie transformed and uprooted the formal feudal world in Europe, a world based on changeless tradition and the strict regulation of trade and production. Right? This division of labor, right, industrial advance and dictatorship of the commodity, right, turned the feudal world on its head. What's a commodity? What's a commodity? Why is that unique to the modern world? Okay, I think that's the beginning of a definition. A commodity is more than its use value. It also has a fetishistic value. It's a value of something that is a good in itself. Right? We pursue commodities not merely because they're useful to us, but because we desire them. Right? There's something more to a commodity. A commodity has a unique personality in the modern world, right? Think of Apple, right? What else is another commodity that people desire? Mercedes-Benzes, right? Okay, this is something particular for Marx. The definition of the commodity is something specific to the modern mode of production, the capitalist mode of production. All right? Kings became dependent upon this new economic class for the projects and their wars. The capitalist class became the center of both of the economic as well as the political world. The world itself was shrunk. The map, the globe, and traditional political boundaries were penetrated and neutralized by the international power of trade. Right? The capitalism had emerged and become larger than the nation-state itself. Okay. As the economic base of production shifted from feudalism to capitalism, so did class relations and boundaries. Marx tells us that the capitalist class is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. It is only the newest kid on the block and the most powerful in the contemporary. The bourgeois class revolutionized the world not because of its special identity, talent, or because of the emergence merely of technology. What actually happens for Marx is that this class was itself a surprise to history. A revolutionary form of economy emphasizing private right and property, market exchange and profit, wage labor and industrial production emerges with specific changes to human beings, to psychology, and their social relations. Everything is transformed in the image of this new economic system. These relations struggled against and finally overturned the social order of the Middle Ages and created the foundations of what we now know as modern Europe and the Americas. This historical evolution in the relations with society led to material and productive and political revolutions that removed one class from power, the feudal monarchy and aristocracy, and install another in place. Marx and Engels write, the bourgeoisie has at last conquered for itself exclusive political sway, domination. The execution of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole of the class that is the bourgeois. The new world that emerges from this transition is cold and alienating, a harsh reality, where cash payment, egotistical calculation, exchange value, and free trade are made the fundamental realities of life. Do I have the... Yes, I do. The right quote. In short, Marx and Engels tell us that the exploitation of feudalism has been exchanged for the naked, shameless, direct, and brutal exploitation of capitalism. Under these new conditions for Marx and Engels, this is perhaps one of the two most famous quotes from them, especially from Marx. All that is solid, all that we can believe in, melts into air. All that is holy, all that was religiously held as sacred, is profaned and denounced. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses science, for Marx, his real conditions of life, and his relations with his time. Where everything is a commodity that can be bought and sold, including us, and has a money price, all specialized products of labor lose their creative meaning, their artistic value, and uniqueness, and become defined merely in terms of dollars and cents. Everything, including us and our labor and our creativity, is reduced to a monetary and quantitative value. History as it had been known came to an end. No longer was tradition seen as a source of meaning and continuity. Disruption, disturbance, and constant innovation would become the new rule of social order and change. The need to constantly update the techniques and materials of production reflected the new permanence of profit-seeking and competition, and society itself is constantly made and remade in reflection of these shifting capitalist foundations. Nothing, not even human nature, escapes the gravity of market society. And for Marx or somebody like Rousseau, we have Hobbes and Locke as wonderful examples of the way in which our modern conceptions of human nature themselves reflect the new conditions, social, material conditions, political conditions of capitalism in the modern era. Here the arguments and politics of nationalism are thrown aside where production and its materials are found spread out within and beyond boundaries, borders. The nation-state itself collapses under the international pressures of capitalist expansion. A new transnational world of capital emerges and uproots the states, the traditional state, the nation-state's traditional place at the center of life. Which nations can afford to avoid the innovations which the market and its sciences bring to bureaucratic, military, and economic development? Evolution, historical evolution, right, and competition. None, should they wish to survive the massive technological and intellectual advance which capitalism had inspired. With this development, production itself, economy, becomes far more centralized, and with it, national and class divisions and outlooks are unified. The regionalism of the Middle Ages is done away with in favor of the efficiencies which a centralized mode of production and a division of labor demand, but this will become the curse and the crisis for capitalism itself, as we will see. Yet the truth, so quiet in here. Just kidding. All right. Yet the truth of capitalist expansion lies hidden beneath the surface. Right? In reality, all the industrial and organizational advances of capitalist society are nothing but the accomplishment of labor. It's actually labor and not capital that is making this advance, giving these benefits to society and pushing forward change. The reorganization of society in conformity with the imperatives of profit, social labor. Society as a whole is remade to become the machine of production, right? The machine of production and the market of consumption. Marx and Engels ask, what earlier century had even a presentiment, a thought, an anticipation that such productive forces slept in the lap of social labor? Right? It is us, it is the social, right? Martin Obama a few years ago said, it is not the capitalists alone, the billionaires who produce society and all the benefits, it is social labor and society as a whole. Here then is the social central contradiction and crisis of capitalism. While the profit and the means of production belong but to a few, the mode of production belongs to society as a whole. This is the problem. Let none imagine Marx and Engels underestimate the revolutionary and productive power and value that capitalism had brought forward. Its productive capacities on their account is transformational. Where they were first given social space by one nation, all others must now follow the trend of capitalism or be left behind in the dust of history. Social relations were rationalized, made to conform to the development and the efficiencies of the new productive order. Capitalism is not simply a productive revolution, but a social one as well. Where this comes from within, as in the British case, because capitalism really springs from within England, it is necessarily adopted by other nations which seek to compete at the international level and must compete. The capitalist class or bourgeoisie became the driving engine of historical change, and with Adam Smith, the key to national development. In the midst of all this, a second fundamental contradiction or crisis within capitalism emerges. Out of the urge to accumulate wealth, capitalists overproduce in spasms of profit seeking. Right? The boom to bust cycle means that a saturated market has outstripped demand. Here then the system seeks to reproduce its productive capacity in an effort to resize and reduce costs and increase competitiveness. Whenever prices drop, the first thing that the capitalist does is to get rid of excess labor. And it's the laborer that suffers in the time of downturn. Labor is released and workers lose their wages. Right? You think of the recent shutdown, a la Trump. When this cycle is systemic, workers buy less, the Buffett principle, demand falls off further, and a downward cycle of recession and ultimately depression is initiated. It is in these moments of crisis that labor becomes aware of its tragic dependency on a suicidal cycle of subsistence wages and terminal underemployment, what we now call precarious employment. For Marx and Engels, the clear goal is for labor to deprivatize, to socialize the means of production and return them to the control of society as a whole. Right? The image depicting the clear divisions between nations and classes, that depicts the viciousness and harshness of class differences. Soviet poster. Political review. Marx puts the crisis of overproduction into clear view. Commercial crises, by their periodical return, put on trial the existence of the entire bourgeois society, capitalism itself. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism, the Dark Age. It appears as if famine, we can think of the Great Crash of 1929 as a wonderful international example of this. It appears as if a great famine, a universal war of devastation, has cut off the supply of every means of subsistence and survival. Here then, the master can no longer feed the slave, the capitalist, the proletariat, and the rationale for sustaining the pillars of capitalism for society as a whole are put on trial. The police take up the front lines, and capital seeks to regrow itself on the basis of shrunken expenses, fewer laborers and lower wages, new efficiencies and global market opportunities, which include the creation of new products and new desires for them. This is how capital deals with the crisis of overproduction and a downturn, precisely at the expense of labor. This boom-to-bust cycle, as we shall see, is a dead end for Marx and Engels, and spells the ultimate doom of the system itself. Through the crisis of capitalist system, they argue, the weapons with which the bourgeoisie brought feudalism to the ground are now turned against capitalism and the bourgeois itself. Where proletarian consciousness, where class consciousness of labor is born, the slave has awoken to the master's weakness. The centralization of productive forces, the organization, and close quarters, the closeness of the working class, their proximity to one another within industrial society has made the working class an organized entity. Here the working class rises to confront the capitalist and to impose its will, hopefully, inshallah, on the social order of production in order to redirect social wealth to its true producers. The proletariat has found itself, its labor, to be one amongst many commodities which fluctuates according to its contribution to the accumulation of capital and profit for the capitalist. In other words, the market determines the value of its labor. The laboring class cannot be happy with this. Having come to this realization as a class, it must now work to overturn the capitalist order as a whole. I think you mentioned Chaplin, the last one. Alienated to one procedure, right? One job, one monotonous, stupid, toiling procedure in the complex after another. In the complex machine of production, labor is reduced to meaningless repetition. Toil in the chain of the division of labor, right? Adam Smith's great discovery of something beautiful, something physical, suddenly becomes the bane of 85% of humankind. Under the conditions of surplus labor, the worker receives only enough to survive. Right? Those of you flipping burgers, as a young person might remember what that means. Just enough to get by. Maybe to put gas in your father's or mother's car. All further value of production is drawn off by the capitalist, the cream from the milk, who is enriched and reinvested in the process of production, sustaining economic as well as political dominance. Right? This is the racket again. This reinvestment by the capitalist expands the division of labor, further disconnecting labor and their own creativity further, and this is crucial for Marx. The laborer's loss of creativity is the loss of their humanity. The dictatorship of the marketplace of commodity comes to conquer labor and the needs of the social world, and ultimately its capacity for self-direction, for freedom. Society no longer directs itself, the market directs society. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, the proletariat remained a political tool in the hand of the capitalists, fighting the capitalist battles on the stage of European wars rather than its own. Yet its labor reached greater degrees of organization, concentration, and awareness. That is, it started to realize its own potential. As all workers were lowered to a similar level of material existence, their common misery became apparent, and they sought political unity across national boundaries. The struggle of against the bourgeoisie in the 19th century had begun, and the tools of the industrial society become those of the proletarian struggle itself. Right? Trade unionism was elevated to the awakening of a more complete form of understanding. Class consciousness had finally emerged for the working class. Of course, for Lenin, those of you who take PSP 210 with me will realize that Lenin said that, of course, trade unionism is never enough because it merely renegotiates the condition of the laborer with the capitalist, but the fundamental asymmetry and inequality remains. The capitalist fight against monarchism and conservatism and the frequent fall of capitalists into the proletariat, right, provide a constant supply of experience and intelligence to Europe's working class. The extremes of capitalism give the proletariat moral and political solidarity and a sense of ethical universality. What does that mean? All other classes, capitalists, strive only for their own particular gains against all others. But the proletariat alone strives for the stabilization of society itself. So it's not Jon Snow or Daenerys Targaryen that couldn't enter the Game of Thrones. It's the working class. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. For Marx and Engels, even the progressive amongst the bourgeoisie would recognize this social mission and join the fight with the working class for universal justice. Can the labor, to a certain extent, John Stuart Mill and others in the late 19th century, left liberals recognize this? Can the labor identify with the national or personal ideals of modern liberalism? They cannot. Wages, precariousness, and universal alienation has made all workers into one form. Their community is with each other and stretches across national boundaries, as we've already spoken about. Out of this new universality, a revolutionary, and it's the core word, revolution, right? A revolutionary logic emerges. The only success they can have is in destroying the international system of their captivity. Doing it in one country is never enough. And this is what Yanis Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders are trying to think about now. Creating an international left that works against national authoritarian monopolies, a la Hungary, Orban, or a la Trump, or a la Xi Jinping in China, the great president for life. Well, my friend Putin, of course. Marx and Engels write, the proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole of official capitalist society being sprung into the air. Here, the master-slave relation of capitalism has become a paradox and a contradiction. For Marx and Engels, the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to rule, to be the ruling class in society. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent and unable to assure an existence to its slave. That it has to feed him, the working class, rather than being fed by him. Marx and Engels made it clear that the communist movement itself must, at all times, aspire to a universalist program. It should spawn no national or local tribes and always seek to transcend and bridge national borders, despite Stalin's idea of communism in one country. Right? Here, then, they suggest a kind of vanguardism, the idea of a vanguard, a leading party at the head of the movement. The communist movement and party plays a leadership role by virtue of its advanced theoretical and practical understanding, and aims to emancipate the working class and ultimately society as a whole. Who's the great example of this in the 20th century? Some of you wear T-shirts with him. Che. Che. Right. Che Guevara. Class consciousness is the goal of the communist program. The proletariat itself is socially and politically marginalized and bears little theoretical or political capacity in the working class to diagnose its common condition or consider moves to resolve it. Right? Against all those who had and continue to suggest otherwise, Marx and Engels made it clear that communism is not an abolition of private property. They're not against private property, right? In general or for the individual. No, it's the specific form of bourgeois private property, a form of property or capital which sustains class dominance, exploitation, and alienation in society. That is what needs to be eliminated. They make it quite clear. Communism deprives no man, or hopefully woman, of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is deprive him or her of the power to subjugate the labors of others by means of such appropriation. Capitalist accumulation. Domination and exploitation are to be eliminated, not ownership. Right? The accumulated capital of bourgeoisie is not merely economic on this account, as imagined by the British political economists like Locke or Smith. No, the absolute right to private property ends with an understanding of the social and political function as well, where labor is converted into profit and profit into political dominance. Society is a productive collective. It's made subject to the power of the class, which has become the sole owner of productive capacity and the sole consumer of labor. This transfer of power and monopoly over social labor to the capitalist class must be terminated, and power restored to its rightful source, the working class. Thus, which is everybody for Marx, including the capitalists themselves, or at least they should be. Thus, the abolition of private property is the termination of its monopoly by one class and of the ideological or political arguments and justifications for sustaining it. Liberalism. Both capitalism and liberalism are here targeted on the historical chopping block. What is the key to capitalist accumulation? Wage labor. Right? Anybody flip burgers? That's how they keep you down. The man keeps you down. Wage labor. Wages are set to a minimum that allows the worker to live but never to accumulate enough capital to become a capitalist. All values produced by labor above and beyond this bare minimum is shaved off like cream from the milk by the capitalist. This arrangement Marx and Engels called the surplus theory of labor. Surplus theory of labor. More than this, labor, a central aspect of individual and human development, is dictated by market demand as interpreted by the capitalist. The isolated labor left to the worker adds insult to the injury of his poverty or her poverty and sustains the crucial class division which makes these class relations permanent. Right? So the laborer does the sucky work and never is really able to develop his or her own true human, creative, and productive capacity that reflects their own potentials, needs, wants, and aspirations. In contrast, communist society organizes, not Stalinist communist society, right? There's before Stalin and after Stalin as far as communist society goes. In contrast, communist society organizes productive forces and labor in order to improve the condition of all, not some at the expense of others. Society makes individual initiative possible, and the value of production returns to the ends of social improvement for all. Marx and Engels write, in bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality, and the goal is to switch this, to invert this binary. In communist society, by contrast, value is produced organically in reflection of us, and is not dominated by a mechanism of value production which amounts to market blackmail. Produce or perish. One could add profit as well. From Marx's time to that of our modern day Reaganites and Thatcherites, Theresa May being one of them in England, the incentive argument has restated itself. It argues, upon abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. Communism is a danger because nobody will have an incentive to work. But Marx and Engels ask how this can be true, when 99% of the population already have nothing and no promise of change, yet continue to work without stop, not merely for survival, but for dignity as well. Is it the hope of winning the lottery which sustains the working class's loyalty to law, production in capitalist society? No, it's actually their wish to live and create, to be valued members of society, which sustains them even in the capitalist condition. Right? This is Hegel's notion of recognition. Without social recognition, our individuality is worthless. Under Marx and Engels' communism, this would be made the central and open purpose of economic life and activity. An exploitation of these fundamental human needs and potentials, creativity and labor, would be politically suppressed. The philosophical defense of capitalism, liberalism, simply has nothing to justifiably argue in its defense on this position from Marx and Engels. They write of the liberal position here that your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. Just as your jurisprudence, your theory of law, is but the will of your class made into a law for all. A will whose essential character and direction are determined by the conditions of the existence of your class. The defense of private property as an essential aspect of individuality and freedom falls down. Locke, Hobbes, Smith fall down. In reality, the ideas, institutions, culture, and self-conception which the bourgeois hold dear are nothing but a reflection of the basic economic fact of their domination. And Lebanon, like any other modern capitalist society, reflects this class division. Right? Marx and Engels' historical materialism puts the liberal worldview into context. Humanity's consciousness changes with every change in the conditions of its material existence, in its social relation and in its social life. Right? If you're a member of the working class, you have a set of possibilities for a worldview. If you are a member of the capitalist class, you look very different at the world around you, and you have very different values. In fact, you're probably more conservative because you have more to lose from any changes which come to the status quo. That's a word made famous by the 20th century Marxist thinker Georgy Lukács, reification. It's on your sheet, I'll explain it. The bourgeois have come to take their own beliefs to be natural, to be universal, to be transhistorical, and having so doing made their class interests into universal laws. As a prime example of this, for thinkers like Hobbes and Locke and Smith, poster boys for liberalism and capitalism, and others, private property is deduced from both divine and natural sources and inscribed into the very understanding of reality, and made into an ontology, a theory of reality, as well as human nature. Can't escape it for these guys. Right? In short, they took the dominant social and political ideas of their time to be universal natural truths. Reification. The history of ideas, a subject not forgotten by CVSP 204, right, is itself a mirror in which the evolution of production, class relations, and consciousness is inscribed. We can see ideology in the construction or the elements of CVSP in its readings as well. Can ideas revolutionize, or at least it's some of its course readings? Can ideas revolutionize society? No, but a change in the conditions and social relations of production can unleash, suppress, encourage, or discourage ideas. Where the material changes of society remain hidden behind the myths of ideology and power, like freedom or private property, some ideas come to seem natural and are given the status of eternal truths. All of these, for the communist founders and their present-day descendants, are but reflections of the social relations mandated by the modern mode of production, capitalism. Or, I mean, we could say that liberal capitalism has moved on to become something transnational. David Harvey calls it neoliberalism. That's a term you might come across someday. Let's see what we're doing here. Against this background, the second pillar of historical materialism comes that the history of all society up to the present, as we mentioned, is a history of class conflict. No ideas or institution escape this gravity, including the scientific. Even scientific laws and facts have a social life and history. They are used and made by society, and this reflects the social relations of production. Right? Nothing is sacred, and the communist revolution is made the first true revolution. It is the first because it alone declares the need to depart from all previous experience and precedent. Because all previous experience and history has been the history of class conflict. Right? This is the first revolution to recognize that and to propose an alternative. In this light, the 20th century Marxian Walter Benjamin, Marxist theorist or communist theorist, Walter Benjamin tells us that the French revolutionaries of July 1830, of the uprising in France, fired their guns at the clocks in Paris. This symbolic attack upon time was the basis of the need for revolution. History itself must be restarted on a wholly new footing, for all previous time has been the time of injustice. Benjamin writes, a historical materialist cannot do without the notion of a present which is not a transition, but in which time stands still and has come to a stop. We must stop the past, right? And with stopping the past and that revolution, not merely of the political world around us, we transform human nature as well, right? This is the radical transformation needed in order to begin even to see the possibility of a transformation of the social, political, and economic world around us, to even come to recognize its possibility. With the realization of the communist state after the revolution and the successful implementation of the 10 socialist measures, 1917, outlined in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels argued, actually they're not yet talking about 1917, they're talking about a theoretical, successful communist revolution in the future. Marx and Engels argued that the state itself would be eliminated, where the social and political had become united. Politics comes to an end. For Marx, like Machiavelli and Aristotle before him, politics itself is nothing but the effort to mediate between class interests in order to strike a balance in the name of social order and productivity. For Marx and Engels, then, the end of class conflict is also the end of politics. Pretty radical idea. And ultimately, the existence of the state as a political monopoly and power divorced from society. Turning upside down, you know, I'm doing Kant in this class, but turning upside down Kant's notion of individual autonomy here, society itself becomes directly self-ruling. It becomes autonomous, and the liberal promise of popular sovereignty is finally realized, right, in socialism and ultimately communism. All right. I'm going to skip Hegel, though he's on, or there's a comparative chart of historical development comparing Hegel's dialectic idealism on the left to Marx's material dialectic on the right. I'm going to leave that by the wayside and let you chew on that at home because we simply don't have time. So let me wrap this up. While many today would say that Marxian and communist thought have been relegated to the dustbin of history, been rejected and historically overcome, Marx's voice continues to call out to us in the present. Right? Alienated capitalist production. Purple people. It is not exploitation that increasing the global centers of industrial production beyond Europe and the sweatshops of Asia, and the sweatshops in the West progressively as well, as we reduce labor standards, is not the welfare state disintegrating in many European countries, leaving masses vulnerable to the relocation of production and employment, Germany pointing its finger at unprofitable Greece and saying you should get rid of your welfare state, while capitalist and successful export Germany gets to enjoy a welfare state, right? The marriage of the welfare state and capitalism has come to an end. Is not global warming directly correlated with the production and consumption inspired by market society, as well as the fetishism of commodities and its relationships as well? Right? In other words, capitalism and its destructive consequences only grow more extreme globally, day by day, making socialist revolution and ideas perhaps more relevant and necessary than ever. Many within today's labor movements and the left continue to be inspired by Marx and Engels and hold on to a very different hope for the realization of the creativity and dignity of labor in society and the political means that are necessary to attain that. From this point of view, the goals of modern democracy, equality, freedom, and enlightenment are only achievable with the state when the state plays a role in politically safeguarding the interests of the whole of society against instability and excesses of wealth and poverty created by the market and the 1%. Well, few call for outright communism, though that might itself seem like a good idea. Most see no other way forward, and socialism continues to present itself as a progressive and more just alternative to capitalism, and we see left progress in a country like Ecuador, Paraguay, most recently Mexico, Greece, and I think there's one other major European country that has moved to the left. But most of the world is moving the opposite direction for the wrong reasons. With that, I'll leave you, and thank you very much for your attention.